Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War Frontline update for the 10th of April 2024. My boy Finn is just about to go off to football practice thanks to his grandparents taking him there. But not before we made some Anzac cookies that are, quite frankly, the most delicious thing I have tasted since the last time I made Anzac cookies. No, these are the best batch ever. Anzac cookies. Chef's kiss. Anyway, that's utterly irrelevant. Let's go to the front line. But before we go there, I just want to pop into what General Chris Cavoli, the commander of the US European Command, has said in a hearing. He's told HASC that the Russians are currently firing 5 times as many artillery shells as the Ukrainians on the battlefield, and that number will go up to 10 to 1 in a matter of weeks as the Ukrainians continue to ration. We're not talking about months, we're talking hypothetically, he said. So I guess there's some confusion about how much artillery the Ukrainians are using at the moment, and that is because there's all this talk about the Czech initiative, and then of course you got the Estonian one on top of that, if that ever comes to pass. And you have the different amounts of money and whether they're actually getting to the front line. No, none of the Czech artillery ammunition has got to the front line yet, as far as I know. But it's a case of using up stockpiles before that does get there, knowing that it will come, and so therefore it gives you permission to use more. So I think the Ukrainians are starting to use more ammunition in certain places. We've definitely seen that in the video imagery that I've seen that has shown, I think intuitively, at least as my understanding goes, an uptick in artillery ammunition usage or artillery usage, but they are still at a massive deficit compared to the Russians at a 5-to-1 ratio that could rise depending on where it goes. Interestingly, in that hearing, there was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Dr. Wallander, has stated that the Russian oil fields and refineries that the Ukrainians have been attacking qualifies civilian infrastructure, which is really interesting because it's not defined as such in the law of war manual that the American military has. So some weird things going on with the messaging from the Americans about whether the Ukrainians should or shouldn't hit oil refineries. Anyway, I digress. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the video at the moment. Right. Looking at a map that JR has awesomely done, is worth reminding you, and I talked with Greg Terry last night and did the mapping, and there were some moments where I don't know, he was particularly dubious about the mapping, what it says, that I don't. Greg said, I don't care what the maps say. I know that that the Russians are in this particular place or in that particular place. And of course, I was speaking to JR about the map afterwards, and I forget to tell people that the lines on these maps are Russian defensive lines. So I'll repeat what I've got on my screen at the moment for you. All lines represent Russian defensive lines. There will be grey zone in between Russian and Ukrainian lines of varying width, which means that usually to the west of the Russian lines, the Russians will be attacking, and there will be Russians there. So there will be streets that the Russians are fighting in, for example, in say Krasnohorivka or Chaziv Yar, that won't come up as behind the red line because they don't control it. They're attacking into there. It's dynamic. They're fighting. There are Ukrainians in the same kind of sector. Russians are there. Everyone's having to go at each other. Okay, so the Russians are attacking, but they don't necessarily firmly control that ground, and that is signified by grey zones. We cannot show grey zones on this map because it would be too confusing. There are 3 defensive lines from the 3 mappers already, so it's very difficult to then throw in a further colour and line and whatnot to represent grey zones. So I thought it was really important that we reminded people of that, because you might think that these maps are wrong, but actually it's not. They don't show the grey zones. In fact, although there are quite a number of changes on the front line, Andrew Perpetua on his mapping today has some fairly extensive changes to the grey zone, which means that the Russians are attacking in a number of places, might well be sort of quasi in control or attacking into places. It hasn't mapped at the moment to a change in Russian control, but that could well be forthcoming. Right, in that northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea, there are no changes again. It's interesting that Greg on the live stream last night was saying that he reckons this is the most kind of the area that he's most comfortable with, I guess. That the Ukrainians are doing a good job of holding the Russians back there. I think that's broadly true. It's surely self-evidently the case, since there have been no changes to control over the last sort of 2 weeks. Then when we come down to past the Liman salient west of Crimea, past the Seversk front line, or to the bottom of this first front line actually, there are some gains for the Russians towards Vimka, which is along this railway line that they've been pushing up for some time. They have made gains there, but of course, actually when you look at the distance they have gone, and this since May the 30th last year, so that's 6 months, and that's 9 months it's taken them to go 3 kilometers. So although you think, they are pushing, and this can be said along most of the front line, really, it's about perspective and understanding how slowly the Russians are going, even though at certain places we think, that's really quite quickly. There was an area actually over the last 24 hours that the Russians have moved a little bit more quickly, and we'll come to that in a wee while. Right, so the situation on the northeastern front says, Surat Mat's a pro-Russian mapper. The Russian army made small advances along the railway roads towards Vimka. Okay, so then we come down to the Bakhmut area, and we can see that although there are no changes to the mapping here, there were some extensive changes there yesterday, and this is because the Russians are really pushing. They're dropping troops off in these key areas of the tree lines to the north and south of this most easterly part of Chaziv Yar, but I think they're also tentatively dipping their toes in by, a little bit more than that's an understatement. They're fighting on the eastern streets of this settlement as they kind of do. As Andrew Perpetua said in his live stream last night, they try and flank one way, flank the other, and then just go straight through the middle anyway, is often the course that they take, and that seems to be what they're doing there. Surat Maps talks about a little bit of a gain here, and that is from yesterday, but I don't know that I read this out anyway. Oh yeah, I did do actually. Yeah, so that's a little bit of a gain that we saw yesterday. I spoke about in the live stream. I think that's about there. But I want to just dip into Tatarigami's thread on Chaziv Yar that I didn't get a chance to yesterday. So he says the battle for Chaziv Yar is a litmus test for both sides. Losing control of it will have dire results for Ukraine. Failure to capture Chaziv Yar on time would raise doubts about Russia's ability to seize Donbass. Okay, that's foundation of this thread. I don't know that I agree with that premise, that losing control of it would have dire consequences for Ukraine. I don't know. I guess we'll see. I think it will be a massive challenge. There's no doubt about that, because what happens is suddenly Konstantinivka here, Druskivka, and then up to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. These become much closer to artillery, and they will be focusing on these rather than hitting them whilst really concentrating on the front lines elsewhere. These will become almost the front lines, as I think the Ukrainians will have to rely on defences that have been built behind Chaziv Yar. You could say that could be dire result, depends how you define it. Chaziv Yar's geography makes it a good defensive position, particularly compared to Bakhmut. I've said this previously. Blocking Russian progression toward key cities in the Donbass. This is evident on the elevation map, with warmer colours marking higher altitudes and colder colours indicating lower ones. So Chaziv Yar here is on the higher ground. You've got the Russians taking that higher ground north of Ivanivsk, and that's why I said that this canal or canal micro district area was the most important area for the Russians to take. That Mount Baba here means that they are on a par, and this is their best route into Chaziv Yar. But otherwise, it is pretty challenging. There's also, I believe, marshes. You've got river areas. You've got boggy areas, and you have heights, as well as a canal to contend with. So we'll go back and look on my map. Chaziv Yar is potentially challenging. It's got a bit of everything. Now, this canal that comes up here is interesting, that Andrew was saying on his live stream that actually it's not massively full of water due to the fact that the reservoirs that would be filling these canals have been blown, and therefore it's basically just rainwater that's in these. However, it will still be a challenge for the Russian mechanized equipment to cross it. They'd still need bridging equipment. It's a bit like a massive glorified tank ditch, so you're not going to be able to get over that. But there are, like I've said before, the last couple of days, JR has mapped these culverts that they can drive across. And I was wondering if Andrew was aware of them, to the point where I think he was saying that it's going to be difficult for the Russians to get across there. But if those culverts are traversable, then actually that would make it somewhat easier for the Russians in those areas. Anyway, back to Tatarigami. The road linking Chaziv Yar and Bakhmut has multiple bridges over the water channel, which runs through the eastern part of the town, creating a natural defensive barrier. With proper resource allocation, Chaziv Yar can be a formidable obstacle to advancing Russian troops. If Ukrainian troops retreat from the eastern side, the bridges will probably be destroyed. Though the canal is not deep, it can impede vehicles, shifting the battle to infantry-centric. Orange-marked areas lack water channels but are divided by pipes, as seen in the photo. So actually here, that's relatively easy in that place. I was under the impression I might need to look at the canal a little bit more closely, because that is definitely won't need bridging equipment. But I'm sure in other areas that canal is more pronounced. So I might have to revise some of my theories on the defensive capabilities of that canal. Traditionally, Russians use airborne forces in key directions, while current airborne units resemble regular infantry. They are more mobile. The use of regiments from the 98th Airborne Division and 11th Air Assault Brigade proves the importance of this direction for their command. So that's where it's all being fought at the moment, fighting in those easternmost areas. The tree lines there and tree lines here. Ivanivska appears to be largely under Russian control at the moment. The probability of eventual Russian advancement into the Canal District remains high. I mean, it's happening right now, especially considering the destructive power of carb bombs, which obliterate defences and buildings, and the advantage of artillery complicating the defence of the area. That is indeed what is happening. There are some claims that there is close air support from Russians at the moment in the Chaziv Yar area, so they are flying potentially with impunity over this region. Indeed, this is a video from Noel Reports from yesterday. He says a pair of Russian Su-25s providing close air support, pretty much roaming freely over Chaziv Yar. Ukraine doesn't have much needed air defense systems, fighter jets, or man-pads. You'd expect them to have man-pads, but apparently not in sufficient numbers to shoot them down. This is really problematic. Absolutely. If this is the case, then this is an absolute travesty. Let's watch the video. So firing off flares, that's their defense. Just seems what a wasted opportunity if that is indeed right now at Chaziv Yar. Insane. Anyway, to continue, the assault on April the 4th by Russian troops resulted in high casualties and a loss of numerous vehicles among the assaulting troops, as evidenced by a video released by the 67th Brigade. However, despite the initial success, this recent assault has raised some concerns. Front Intelligence Insight analysed videos and satellite imagery to reconstruct the route it travelled, the dirt road to Chaziv Yar, without encountering minefields, allowing them to enter the canal district without facing mines. It can indicate a major issue. Russia deploying 4 Su-25 aircraft in close air support. So here we go, talking about that again. In close air support missions near Chasiv Yards, another sign of a bigger problem. It shows the gravity of Ukrainian air defense problems and shortcomings in short-range air defense capabilities. Russians are likely to exploit this vulnerability further. In our assessment, the situation is difficult due to several issues: delays in fortification construction, and lack of personnel from delayed mobilization. There's an obvious shortage of supplies from the West, especially in ammo, artillery, and air defense systems. The terrain alone is not enough to halt advancing Russian forces. Heroism and skillfulness of defenders can't be the only pillar of defensive tactics. Hence, Ukraine needs to have a comprehensive defense approach that accounts for potential weaknesses and previous mistakes. Meanwhile, the widening advantage of Russian forces over Ukrainian forces is expected to peak this year unless Ukraine and the West take emergency measures. Aid from North Korea, Iran, and China ensures Russia's capacity to sustain tactical advancements for a year or two. So it's challenging there, and I think the Russians, especially if this canal is actually quite traversable in certain areas, apparently not having too much water in at the moment will mean that actually, although it's a bit of a natural barrier, it won't be the barrier I was thinking it would have been. So I have to, as I say, look into that a little bit more. Nonetheless, no movement today, but I think that's not to say there isn't large changes, and that's one of the areas where there are big changes to the grey zone in Andrew Perpetua's mapping. So lots more grey zone covering basically this whole area there. In fact, I think I can save that. Here we go. I can show you exactly where it is happening. So there it is. That's what JL sent me, showing that actually the grey zone has vastly increased around the Bodnivka area and west of Ivanivska. So right around here and right around here. That's where the Russians are attacking at the moment. And you can expect possible movements in the map tomorrow as a result of that. Then we come down, there are a large number of pins and none of them the right colour in the Avdiivka area. You can see that according to Deep State maps and Suret maps and Andrew Perpetua, that at different places along this whole salient, the Russians are making gains. And in fact, down here, these are fairly significant gains. We'll come to that in a second. Up here, around, well, first of all, a little bit of a move to the north towards Novokonyovo here, which is that settlement. Deep State map has a move by the Russians, and then around the Bedici area, some fairly significant gains all along that northern part of this salient, and a little bit by Semenivka, this small village on the other side of the river. That's not good news that the Russians are moving through that settlement. So none of it particularly good news today. We have here in the Bedici area up there, the Russian army capturing new areas of Bedici on the western shore of the Derna River, in addition troops advancing Semenivka, reaching the centre of the village. And on the other hand, Russian forces took control over the trench system along the road between Tonyenka and Yezno-Brodivka. Defences there are broken, is the claim. Now, as we come further to the south here, there was a really big advance. So Andrew Perpetua is talking about the expectations were the Russians are going to be held somewhere around here, maybe this field, maybe back here. But they did an advance that's been geolocated it might be up here somewhere, really close to this tree line and road coming north to south there. And that was a much larger advance than was expected. And this is one of those rare times where the Russians have made large advances in a single day. I mean, if you think about the edge of Tonyenka to where they are there, that's about 5 kilometers in all. So for a few days worth of maneuvers, they have actually potentially achieved quite a bit. Now, although there's no change for the other mappers, and Surat Maps has this is under Russian control, of course, all the usual claims about Surat Maps will be relevant for here, which is that just because they attack there doesn't mean they control it. They broke through with, I think, 3 vehicles or something, but that being repelled, it doesn't mean that they control that ground. However, it's probably likely that they will at some point within next week control that ground. And that means it's easier for them to move through Pervomysky because as they're controlling stuff to the north, it's very difficult for the Ukrainians, to supply their Pervomysky troops as they're grinding their way through that long, thin settlement. And in fact, there's now evidence that they control it completely as they planted a flag to the very west of Pervomysky, which is, I don't know if I have included it. I had it yesterday. No, not there. No, so I don't have that. But anyway, that's what we saw yesterday briefly. So not looking good in that whole area, I have to say. This is challenging. But then I don't know where their full proper defensive lines are going to be. We know they're somewhere back here. You can't build them too close to the front line because you need excavators and maybe even contractors. You're not going to place them next to the front line because they'll be absolutely hammered. So that's why they've, in general, been sort of 50, 70 kilometers behind the front lines where they have been building them as your kind of fallback point. Right, okay, now we're going to come down to Krasnohorivka, where it seems to have really picked up for the last few days. Novelska, important for holding out, and I think they're still doing a really good job. Defenses there, pretty good. Andrew Perpetua had a theory about Krasnohorivka that actually they pivoted to there. And he said that they were making these gains in Pobjeda, but the Ukrainians stopped them and put up really good defenses there. And indeed, I talked about how important this is as a small settlement. And it's really interesting. Andrew thinks exactly the same, that this is quite a key place. And the Ukrainians probably recognise that. And so they've stopped the Russians there. They appear to have stopped them north around Novelska. So you've got these two tiny little agricultural settlements that are holding out and stopping that larger flanking of sort of Mariinka, Krasnohorivka as a whole. And so what they've done, rather like we were talking about earlier, is try flanking one side, try flanking the other. If you don't succeed there, just go straight through the middle. And so that's what they appear to be doing, is throwing themselves at Krasnohorivka. But rather like we have seen in the Avdiivka area, and we were just looking at this area by Tonyenko, and Andrew Perpetua on his live stream said, look, I've just got high resolution imagery of here, and there are 91 vehicles that we found. 6 of them are Ukrainians, and 85 of them are Russians. There's just phenomenal losses that Russians are taking, but they're taking that ground. They're grinding on and gaining territory. I say that every day, but that's their calculation, and it's no doubt the same in the Krasnohorivka area as well. Oops, I went a little bit too far. They are at the moment fighting in the southern areas, southeast and southern areas. It's going to be pretty much grey zone this. There were claims that they were repelled. Well, last week they attacked and were repelled. And then there's been a bit of a calm, and I think they were trying to fight elsewhere. And then they're going for the full-on frontal again. And I don't know how successful the Ukrainians have been at repelling them. Andrew says on Twitter, Russia's pivot to Krasnohorivka has happened, at least in the people I talked to early in the weekend, maybe earlier. It stemmed from the failure to exploit Pobjeda, and I personally view it as a minor miracle because I was very worried about that area. So that's what I was talking about, that small settlement just to the south there, Pobjeda. And they pivoted north, and their first attempt, as per usual, is a full frontal assault. If Ukraine can repel this, they would likely try to flank the north of the town. If that fails, I think the situation could develop into a pretty large battle. In Russia's mind, they have to continue pushing west to bypass Kurakova and outflank Vuhledar. Novomykhailivka turned into a train wreck. Pobjeda failed. Now they try Krasnohorivka. So this is the understanding that although they're making gains through Novomykhailivka, it is costing them immense amounts of equipment. This is a massive equipment graveyard around here, and so the implication there is that they've kind of failed at Novomykhailivka. I don't know if that. I presume that will still continue. They failed at Novelska. They failed at Pobjeda. So they're just going to smack it through the middle of Krasnohorivka, and that could just end up being a huge battle. In the background, the White Angels have been serving to evacuate people from Krasnohorivka. I've been posting videos of them doing so for weeks on my map as they release the footage. So the Ukrainians themselves are obviously cognizant of this and have been trying to evacuate people from there for some time. But as well you know by now, they don't half hold on tenuously to living in places that really you shouldn't. So yeah, it's all about Krasnohorivka at the moment. Lots of activity there. And there's this was what was reported yesterday with video footage coming from there. We look at this video. You can see, look, the number of vehicles coming in there. I say the number of vehicles. To be honest, that's what seven vehicles in a convoy, 6 or 7, and getting hammered with some artillery. But even though you do see artillery, which is a little bit of a change from recently, because previously we were seeing none, that isn't the kind of artillery you need to absolutely destroy a convoy. But the other thing to note, of course, is that convoy is relatively small. That was a 6-7 vehicle convoy, and in times past we might have seen 30 to 40 pieces of equipment in a similar sort of attack. But yeah, the Ukrainians are under some pressure there in the Krasnohorivka area, and moving on, Novomikhailivka, as mentioned, the Russians are making some gains there, some small gains in the middle of the town, as according to Surrey maps. Deep State maps agreeing with a bit of mapping from the other two just to the south. So really, it's that one in the middle that's worthy of note. And then no other changes to the front line, although, as mentioned yesterday, there were claims that the Russians had got a foothold in Robotyne. Then the Ukrainians officially came out and denied that was the case and said, don't believe them, it's not true. But Surrey maps, you can see, has the Russians half in control of Robotyne. The other two mappers don't. In fact, there's a really significant difference between the control lines of Andrew Perpetua compared to Surrey maps. That's over a 2 kilometer difference between those two mappers. So somebody is obviously wrong there. I assume it's probably a grey zone in the southern part of Robotyne. Whether that the Russians control it, I somehow doubt, but it could of course be true. Anyway, that's all we have for the front line. I didn't dip into the Institute for the Study War. I'll probably get back to it tomorrow. I've just been a little bit all over the place with the school holiday still on. Nonetheless, thanks for watching. Really appreciate you being here. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.